Welcome back to our fifth and final lecture in our paper on the prayer book, Rites, Rubrics and Reasons. Today we're looking at some of the theological significance of the prayer book, our prayer book in Anglican life, our Anglican life. Alan and I are going to do a bit of a tag team throughout this lecture. First, a recap on what we covered last time. I looked with you at the pastoral liturgies, the occasional services. It's a jargon word for things that happen occasionally, weddings, funerals, and the whole suite of different services around the death of somebody we love. Those services, they're there to offer pastoral care to people and also there for particular occasions. We talked a little bit about using these services and finding prayers for particular occasions and the sorts of places you can go to in the prayer book if you suddenly find yourself dealing with a situation where prayer is appropriate. What we're going to do today is a whole lot of things. We're going to look at the theology around common prayer. Some discussion of our specifically New Zealand context and the diversity we have between different tikanga here. We'll look at the prayer book as a lens on Anglican theology. I'll talk a little bit about what I'm calling commissioning liturgies, the ones involving baptism, confirmation and renewal, and the various liturgies around ordination. Of course, the catechism will get a mention, and the prayer book today and where it might be going over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So let's think for a bit about the theology of common prayer. Prayer that we hold in common, prayer that the church as a whole has given to us as the whole people of God. One of the things we remember from the creeds that we say is what's often called the marks or notes of the church. The church is one, holy, Catholic and apostolic. And our common worship is an expression of those really basic beliefs about the church and what it is, what essentially we are. The church is one. And of course, having common prayer, common forms of prayer that we come together to join in, either at a space on Sunday or maybe when different parts of the church are meeting on different occasions. That common prayer creates a sense of unity and it reflects the unity that we have. We're not a whole lot of individuals. We are people who are part of something that is bigger than us. The church is holy. And that means that just as God is holy and we worship a holy God, we should worship in a holy way. So there's lots of things in there about our rites, our rubrics, those stage directions which tell us how to do these services in a way which reflects who we are, which has a sense of integrity and a sense of reverence around it. The church is Catholic. Now, this is not a reference to one particular denomination. Catholic comes from a word which means universal. Someone who has Catholic tastes in books will read almost every genre. Someone who has Catholic tastes in wine will drink almost every different colour of wine. It means universal. Again, that sense of we belong to something that is bigger than us and bigger than our own little group, which I think is incredibly important. The church is apostolic. Our worship is patterned on the very earliest worship of the church. And this started really quite early on. While we were still within the New Testament period, there was a sense of codification of rules of worship. In the same way that we see in the Old Testament some common themes around Jewish worship, particular psalms for particular occasions, for example. So the shape of the liturgy hasn't changed all that much from the time of the earliest apostles. Eucharistic worship is recognisable. What we do and what they did in the time of Justin Martyr, 190 something CE, is recognisably the same sort of service. Our morning and evening prayer, they are based on very early monastic patterns of using the Psalms, of using particular biblical texts to worship God. But also, of course, we're apostolic, and the word that comes from that, in the sense of being sent out. That's what apostolic actually means. It means sent. We worship and then we go out to serve in the world. So very much the way we worship recognises some of our basic beliefs about the church. And what we're looking for and what we experience is very much a balance of unity and Catholicity and local expression. The church that worships the same way all around the world, and the church that is us here in this land, in this parish, in this particular locality. And we see both of those in the way we look at it. The prayer book is recognisably Anglican, but it also speaks incredibly strongly of who we are as church here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The lectionary, one of my other books I would have if I was marooned on a desert island with only a small percentage of my library, the lectionary is an expression both of our Catholicity and unity, as well as local expression. Last week I was on retreat at Kopua, which is a Roman Catholic Benedictine monastery. I went along to services in the chapel. Yep, they were having the same readings as I listed in our lectionary, the same sets of prayers and sets of themes around Advent. What I like about the lectionary, don't get me started on this, I can go on for a very long time, is the way it shapes us, not just as people in this land, but all around the world in a whole bunch of different denominations. A Roman Catholic in the United States, a Lutheran in Australia, a Presbyterian in New Zealand, an Anglican in New Zealand, a Methodist somewhere else. We're sharing common readings. It gives us a sense of unity, and it's also incredibly useful for sermon prep, because there are a whole lot of different resources, both printed and online, which look at the same readings. But there's also local expression. In the lectionary, as well as the readings, it sets out the calendar, the saints we celebrate, the people we honour. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we honour, for example, Te Rori, the 12-year-old girl who had a copy of the Gospel of Luke, who was killed in 1836. We celebrate her on the day she died, the 19th of October. That's not going to happen in the middle of the United States or in some little village in England, but it's an expression of who we are. So again, the Catholicity, the all around the world and very much here comes through in the lectionary. It also means that when we're preparing to preach, you don't just pick your favourite passages. Again, we're part of something bigger than us. So here's something to think about, to pause the recording and to think, where have you experienced the common dimensions of our worship life? And a question for you, have you ever been worshipping in another denomination and known what is being said, at what point you are in the service, even if this happens to be going on in a different language? Think about that in the light of what common prayer might reflect.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Sorry for the change of face, not just a bit of makeup this time, but actually a change of person. So if you've forgotten, my name's Alan Burnett, because I'm working with Deborah on these lectures. So lovely to be able to join with you as we tag team through this final lecture in this paper looking at the New Zealand prayer book and our prayer book and our common life. As you will have had that conversation, it'll be interesting to hear back from you in one form or another some of those places. I know that I've been in foreign countries where the language has been completely different, and yet I know exactly when the Sanctus is being said. I know exactly what is happening and what people are likely to do next within a service, which has a remarkable familiarity and sense of belonging, the immediate moment as you experience that. So I hope you've had a similar experience in a place or another. As we move on in our conversation today, we're going to take a little bit of a look at the New Zealand context and the way in which our prayer book and our common prayer life that is established and developed by it has been beneficial to us all within particularly our context of biculturalism within our nation, but also multiculturalism within our nation and the wider province of Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. For those who perhaps don't know the wider structure, the province of our church covers not only the nation of Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also many of the Polynesian islands close to New Zealand at least. And so this prayer book's not only used within our nation, but also within a number of nations in Polynesia as well. And so what happens is that we develop liturgies alongside one another. We develop liturgies that are reflective of our own cultural practices and moments and experiences, which then come together within this collection of liturgies and services and prayers to give us a depth and a grounding that is different from many other places around the provinces of the Anglican Communion. There are not many places where you have three quite distinct cultural expressions merged together and brought together in the same way they are in New Zealand. So we are really blessed with this as we have this collusion of culture and practice, which over time has given us different and quite potent forms of spiritual expression, given us resources to pray and to share in those contexts where perhaps one of those languages is not our primary language, but we walk into these places as ministers and as clergy. And particularly it has given us a connection to this land. One of the other components to this is you find within the prayer book's development, particularly as we look in a moment to some of our theological dimensions of it, the contextualization of our understandings of Jesus into images that are very much of this place and of different cultural expressions, which again give us this broader and rounder sense of who this person is and what the meaning behind their life is. We have been enriched as a whole church really through the liturgies that have been developed through Te Ao Māori as well, particularly in things like the prayer in a home after death and the unveiling of memorial stones or headstones, which are customs within tikanga Māori but have become increasing customs within tikanga Pākehā as well, primarily from that shared resource of it. It's fascinating within the life of common prayer. Everywhere that the Book of Common Prayer and the original sort of mission work of the Anglican community began, that was usually translated locally as well. Of course, the Book of Common Prayer translated into Māori in New Zealand as well, many elements of which continue in other services of Eucharist, which I believe is on 490, if I remember rightly. A more traditional form of that service continues to exist in here, where through the translation of that service, the need to develop understanding and concept in order to articulate Christ and the faith more fully. We have been blessed by that in our tikanga diversity, and particularly as a clergy person, but just as a minister within the Anglican Church, the fact that I know I can sit down and walk into a Polynesian or Māori context, and there are prayer and resources here that do not require me to fully understand and grapple with all of the conceptual dimensions of language, but can pray something that is truthful to my faith, but also pastorally meaningful to that community, is a profound resource to have that not many churches have as a blessing. One of the things that makes the prayer book particularly potent and powerful is that it is a tool of looking at our theology. It is a tool to shape our understanding. It's a tool to work through how we understand our own faith. The prayer book, in a sense, reflects the church's common voice on things that matter. Now, there are countless ways we could talk about this and countless places we could talk about this, even down to the practice of communion and the way in which we undertake that. The fact that there is some degree of commonality is a reflection that these practices form us and shape us. But particular areas that are of significance are in our Christology, our sacraments or our sacramentology, our missiology, and our eschatology. Eschatology, not eschatological, but it is that too. It's a terrible word as you have to get that out too often. Christologically, one of the things you'll find about the New Zealand Prayer Book is that it's deeply Trinitarian. You cannot escape the fact that the Christian God is understood as a Trinitarian God. But that you also find, particularly within our Eucharistic rites, a profoundly high Christology. The worship elevates Christ. We stand for the gospel. We stand for the reception, or depending on your tradition, of the communion, because it is a meeting of Christ coming to be present in our midst. We know that we have an understanding of God's inner life, God's nature, because of Christ's life. And so Christ is elevated in a way within this that even if you didn't understand the language, the simple practices of our rites and our practice would instill within you in a recognition that this person of Jesus is significant and that we must understand that. The power of it is that the fact that we all do that together, and it's reflective of the fact that as a church we have a high Christology, that we believe Jesus to be of significance. The reality of having it in a common prayer form means that no local pastor or priest, no one in particular, can steer us away from that into their own potential direction. Perhaps you might have a pastor that resonates more with God the Father, if such a thing could happen in our Trinitarian thinking. You don't get bombarded with that because our prayer book and our church acknowledges that God is Trinity and that tension must be held as well. Our sacramentology within our language of the Eucharistic liturgies, there is defined forms within this for many, many reasons, partly because this gift of the sacrament, particularly of communion, but also baptism, is a gift from Jesus himself and also a commission from him. We are called to continue that practice until he returns. And so having it locked in here in a form means that it is a practice that is accessible and straightforward, but also routine and standard in a sense. So we know what we are doing and why we are doing it. There is a sense in which it teaches well. The reason that it's in our common prayer, though, is that ultimately this is a gift to us of what has been traditionally defined as an outward and visible form of an inward and spiritual grace. God gives us this means of understanding the grace that has been given to us through a physical form. And once you get into physical form, it has to look like something. Once something is embodied and incarnated, it is going to look like something. And through the church's tradition, this is how that form has taken. And so our Eucharistic liturgies are in, as we discussed earlier in our lectures, in a connection through history back to the very earliest churches, and this need to hold this treasure that Christ has given us. Mission within our prayer book is also significant. We are praying for the church and for the world regularly in our services. We are encouraged in our intercessions to do that. We are reminded always of Christ coming into our midst. But as Deborah's noted on a couple of occasions, the dismissal words of our Eucharist and our services are also a reflection of that. You have come together to enjoy this grace and this fellowship and this blessing that is God's community, but you are always sent out in commission to go and love and serve the world, essentially, or love and serve the Lord by serving the world. We go in peace. The fact that the dismissal is actually a compulsory component of our service is also a reflection of that Christian life is not simply about coming to worship. It is about bringing the light, the joy, the hope, the peace in the Advent season of the reality that we've experienced in our revelation of Christ and our worship of God into the world that is longing to hear of that hope, that light, and that truth. Our worship is also eschatological. Now that basically means just concerning the end, the revelation of the end of times, the coming of Christ again. It's eschatological for a number of reasons, but one of the most powerful to me is the fact that ultimately these collections of prayers and these services reflect what is the core business of the church. The core business of the church is the worship of God, the care of the saints, and the commission into service in the world. Those are all in here. They are all documented and recorded because the church as a whole recognizes those things as our fundamental business. our job, regardless of when Jesus comes back, is ultimately to worship and to witness. And through the prayers and the common prayer of these books, published throughout the world, but particularly in our context, the New Zealand Prayer Book, help us to stay grounded in that reality. It teaches us that our core business as the church is to worship the God that has revealed God's self through Christ, but also who promises to return with the fullness of the kingdom. Our job is to worship. God takes care of the rest. As we continue to think about common prayer as theology, the sense in which it names who God is, it helps us to shape who God is, it helps us to be shaped as the sort of people who will one day inhabit heaven. A few questions for you to consider as a group or as an individual, whether it's over a cup of tea or in your home group, wherever you might be. Is there a prayer or an action within our common prayer, within our New Zealand prayer book or another prayer book that you know of in the Anglican tradition, that has helped you to name God's nature? Has there been a metaphor, a word, a prayer, a sense of who God is by virtue of a prayer that is said regularly that has embedded itself and helped you understand who God is for you in that moment? And if you have come from another denomination, tradition, or country, how has our prayer book, the New Zealand prayer book, shaped or reshaped your theology? Have you been challenged by some of the language that's in that prayer book, or have you found in it this resource to name something you never quite found the names for? What's been your experience coming into it, whether it's from a new tradition or from another tradition or from no tradition? What has been confronting and what has been beautiful as you've engaged with the prayer book as a theological guide? Have a discussion, pause the video and come back to us in a moment.
So how did you get on with that? How have you found our prayer book, the prayers we hear, the prayers we participate in, shaping our theology, how we think about God, and indeed how we think about our lives and other people around us? I remember many years ago, I would go to a particular service in Wellington Cathedral on a Wednesday, and I somehow kind of discovered that a lot of the things I would write on Wednesday afternoon had phrases from the liturgy, while we have yet time, running through them. These things can shape us, sometimes without us really realising it. Now I'll switch tack a little bit. You see, we really are tag teaming on this. The Catechism. It's a really useful teaching resource. Starts on page 926, and it uses the traditional question and answer format. It puts up a question that the framers of this catechism and the one in the original Book of Common Prayer thought people might be wondering about, and it gives a useful answer. It's a useful kind of, if you've ever been faced with those questions, what do Anglicans believe about X, Y, Z? Catechism is always a good place to start. But it's not sometimes definitive. It can lead us into deeper discussions and deeper understandings. So at some point, not during a sermon, I encourage you to flick through the Catechism and see what sorts of things it's talking about. Scripture, the church, different sorts of ministry. So have a look at it someday. Now we're coming to a part of the prayer book I've kind of grouped together is commissioning liturgies. And the first of those are the ones, of course, baptism is admission to communion. And so the way in which we do this, the baptism is the bit that's immediately before the bits with the red pages, which are our various Eucharistic liturgies. There are 3 possible services as part of this. The service of baptism, of confirmation, or of renewal, affirming one's faith. And the services can be used, together or completely separately. Of course, baptism and confirmation are once-only services. We can't be rebaptized or reconfirmed, but people can reaffirm their faith more than once. Baptism, of course, is the way by which we come into the church, the body of Christ. And so there's often a really cool bit of kind of church geography here. In many churches, the traditional place for a font, the bit that holds the water of baptism, is close to the doors through which you enter the building. We enter the church by baptism, and so through the main door into the building, we come fairly rapidly up to the font. And it's a way of reminding us, a way of, the way the shape of the building parallels some of the theological aspects. So baptism, because it's entry into the church, it's not a private rite. I think for a couple of 100 years, you could just kind of rock along to the church on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. Now the church has reverted to a much earlier understanding. This is a public service. Somebody comes to join the church when the church ordinarily gathers for worship. The service of baptism can be conducted by a bishop, a priest, or if a priest isn't available, a deacon. Confirmation, of course, and renewal are one of those services that are presided over by a bishop. And in the baptism liturgy, it's not just the person being baptised, or if they're a baby or a child, their whānau, their parents and godparents speaking for them. The congregation is also making promises. The congregation is also renewing their own faith, proclaiming Jesus as Lord, joining in some of those very early creedal formula. So that someone is joining the church by baptism, we as the rest of the church gathered there are embracing them and expressing our commitment to helping them to live out the promises they're making. Confirmation or renewal, affirmation of faith, it's a response to somebody who has been baptised by professing their faith, by committing themselves to Christian service. For us, we have gone to the very early understanding baptism is admission to communion. When I baptise a baby, I'm always asking parents, are they on solids yet? And if so, they get communion at their service at which they're baptised, as the whole church joins together to welcome somebody into our midst. The church joins together to welcome someone who's come along to reaffirm their faith, to say, yes, these are the promises I made or made on my behalf at my baptism. I want to live these out. And actually, rest of church, I want you to help me. There's part of that that's going on as well. The key thing, of course, in baptism, water. Yeah, all those pet conversations about how much water is around. It can be sprinkling, it can be immersion in water. As long as there's water involved somewhere, it's fine. And the use of the Trinitarian formula. I baptise you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We put enough things around that, some of the scriptures relating to baptism. Large quotes from the Bible. Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost is a particular one. The invocation of the Holy Spirit. The declaration that this newly baptised person is a member of the church. Again, it's talking about this is all of us. This isn't just one person. This is joining something bigger than they are. And there's another sort of commissioning liturgies, the ordinations. And of course, these all follow a common pattern, whether it's a deacon or a priest or a bishop being ordained. They also start off with some things about a common understanding of ministry. And crucially, it acknowledges that all Christians have a ministry by virtue of their baptism. We all, every member of the baptised body of Christ, we all have a ministry. A smaller number of people are set apart by ordination for specific ministries. And each of the ordination services has prefaces which say, this is what is involved in this particular ministry. Plus the person being ordained makes vows before a bishop and before the rest of the congregation. This is what I will do. And of course, Every year in Holy Week, clergy come together as we renew our ordination promises, again alongside our fellow clergy. These are ways of setting someone aside for a particular bit of ministry, but those ministries are always tracked back to the church as a whole. We are there as priests to tend the body of Christ. Deacons are there to serve. Bishops are there to serve, to maintain unity, all of those things. It's a way of saying it is not about one person, it is about the church as a whole, as all of us are commissioned for some sort of ministry or another. So here's a question for you. Baptism and ordination both commission a Christian for ministry. What similarities do you see between these liturgies? I said you not only pause the recording, but you might get out your prayer book and have a quick look at the baptism liturgy or at one of the ordination services. What similarities do you see in those? And what might that be saying about ministry within the whole Church of God?
Well, welcome back again. Hope that was a delightful conversation you had about the differences and the similarities you see between those different commissioning services. I was one of those people who were lucky enough to be an adult when I was baptised, and not long after that confirmed, and then a few years after that ordained. So I was able to kind of hold all of those things at the same time within my experience. And so I can sort of speak to a little bit of the similarities as well as the differences. But as we continue in our lecture today, I'm going to pick up now some of the questions of the prayer book today, particularly considering some of the challenges and the possible future directions it may take in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, the challenges of the prayer book are really dependent on your position within the church and your reflection upon the issues and the challenges of the church. There can be questions, as we've sort of named in the lectures beforehand, that there is a sense in which it is restrictive. It is restrictive because it is trying to keep to a singular voice to some extent the articulation of the church about who God is, about who Christ is, that those are restrictions, but there is also a freedom within that restriction to develop that, but not to go off the theological walkway, I suppose you could say, into an area of your own passion or perspective, but isn't agreed to by the wider church. But one way of framing that really is that one of the challenges of common prayer, and particularly published common prayer in the form of a book, is that it can at times lag behind culture and practice shifts. Now, we have had that for hundreds of years with the Book of Common Prayer. It served the church wonderfully for 400 years, but in that came into context and locations where the language didn't quite meet with the conceptual reality and the experience of people, and before long it stopped being as resonant for the cultures around it as we might say that the New Zealand Prayer Book is today. Within this challenge, or the dynamics of our prayer books, is that you have this tension between the voice of the church's historic articulation and its faith and a particular style and tone, that in each generation there is a request or a demand or a hope that their voice will be added to that longer story and that longer tale as well, so that the core reality of what we say doesn't change. The theology is the same, but the style and the tone in which it is said shifts through time to meet the congregational and cultural dynamics of the place and of the time in which we are working. The challenge of a fixed form of prayer is that sometimes that can lag. The reason that it lags, though, is, as I've named, the incredible importance of it. For anything to shift or change within our common prayer, we as a whole church have to be in agreement about it. We have to not only agree that this is a good thing to do, we also have to agree that it's theologically correct to do that, and then the wording within that theologically correct practice have to also be theologically correct. And so what it creates is a very long process of studiousness, reflection, and careful consideration. It's often called the double round process. And so what happens in order for this to be amended or things to be added to the New Zealand Prayer Book, that General Synod, which is our provincial governance body, will gather and they will accept a proposal about it, and then they will put that, once it is approved, if it is approved, to the diocesan and huiamarangi and other synods around the province. So every diocese and every huiamarangi then has to kind of consent to this transformation and this change or this amendment. Then it returns again in another year to General Synod. So it can take as little as, I shouldn't say as little as, it's a very long time, as little as a few years, but generally speaking, for real change and substantial addition and movement, it takes a very long time. Now, when we think about this as the treasure trove of the church's voice and theology and worship and history, you can understand why it takes time. Other minds, other people, other parts of our family have taken diligent work to produce what is in here now, and we do not adjust it willy-nilly. We adjust it with considered thought and reflecting the need of it within our culture and context, rather than just thinking, well, I can say that better. I don't know if you can, actually. This has been honed very, very well, so we are careful with it. But there is a pathway to change. Some of those changes have also created some of the challenges as well. You will note there are 2 prayer books here. Now, what you'll see is one that was published, I don't know when exactly it was published, but this is the reflection of the 1989 prayer book as it was originally published. This is the most recent redoing of that or reprinting of that. Now, it's hard to show probably through a video, but I can go like this and give you, it's grown by probably 20% over that period of time, primarily through the addition of additional languages that are used within our province and within our communities, and various other elements that have shifted it up. Now, don't get me started on some of this. There are 4, 5, 6, B, E, C, D, all sorts of things going on in here that make it somewhat complicated, but also have tried to hold on to this tradition, as Deborah noted, that we name our liturgies by the page number. And so they're very likely new. You can't go changing page 404. So if you're going to add additional stuff, you have to do something with letters. Otherwise, we're going to get in all sorts of trouble. Now, that has created a challenge where carrying this around and using it for worship is a little bit tricky. But the reality is that the online prayer book is a fantastic resource to draw out of this resource book into the liturgies that you may be producing for your church service worship, but also that we don't need all of this. And so there are elements where you can draw that out in other contexts as well. Now, one of the primary ways that's done in many contexts is the use of digital technology through projectors or televisions, collecting the parts of the liturgy that are needed without having the whole book with all of the various prayers for occasional services and the various events and moments that Deborah spoke to earlier on in our lectures there for our Sunday worship. So there are multiple ways to address that, but as our language grows more diverse, as our occasional services increase, as new events and current occasions occur, this book is likely to get bigger and bigger, which may come to a point where carrying it around is more like having to bring one of those little red trolleys you see on TV all the time, wherever you might be going for worship. Now, considering the future directions of it beyond the prayer book probably getting bigger, that language diversity dimension is a reality. It will likely get bigger because our language diversity in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia is growing, and communities of worship need that language. Perhaps in the future there will be Mandarin added into there. Perhaps in the future, as different cultural groups and languages come to be more common in New Zealand, we may have that. Within my own church at the moment, we have a pastor with us from Brazil. Perhaps we need a Portuguese version of the New Zealand prayer book to add to today's services that we offer. So it's likely to continue to get bigger, which is, of course, also a beautiful thing, reflective of our diversity, but our commonality and our Catholicity, our oneness that Deborah has spoken to at the beginning of the service. One of the dynamics of the future of the New Zealand prayer book is considering which pathway is likely to be the one we go down in terms of our liturgical development. Within our current prayer book, there are really 3 primary forms of the Eucharist. There's the 404, 456 and 476. 404 is the kind of standard across the communion, where every province has its version of the 404. It's basically a reformatting and a modernisation of the Book of Common Prayer with a little bit more Catholicity added back into it. In New Zealand, it's very likely that our theological and liturgical development will track the pathway of what's used in 476, this bicultural dimension of not direct translation, but paraphrasing and contextualization. The utilization of local metaphor, local story, local symbol to tell the story of who Jesus is and who we are and who the church is and what God has done. Within the wider communion, many people adore and love the 476 service. There are others who wrestle with it and struggle with it. And somewhat you do fall into a camp once you get into these things. You're either a bit more of a 404 person or you're a bit more of a 476 sort of person. But nonetheless, that would probably be the track that we will continue to develop, allowing for the voices of those languages to find their own ways of saying much the same thing. And doing it in a way where you can cross over between those services and utilize the words on either side of those pages and know that you're saying something meaningful and in a potent way. That is likely to be where we head in terms of our thinking. Some other elements of it is that the English versions of the Great Thanksgiving and other pits will likely end up in time with additional Te Reo variations in it. At the moment, there's additional Te Reo for 404, and obviously the 476 has a version of Te Reo on the other side, but there will be likely additional spaces where the variation between English and Māori can be chosen by the person leading the service or by the person speaking in that moment in order to more genuinely reflect the cultural reality of New Zealand as a bicultural place in which there is this reality of Māori and English being both official languages. Perhaps there may even be at time an addition of sign language tools in here to help us to articulate that within the life of the church as well. As we take a chance to think about all of that and all that's been discussed not only in this lecture but in the previous 4 as well, I want to ask you the question, or we want to ask you the question really, has your view of the prayer book changed through this course? Have we done something to push you across a line of going, I don't know how I feel about it, to actually I really respect this? Or have we done the opposite? And you've gone from saying, this is a wonderful book, to going, well, now that you've explained it to me, I don't know how much I feel about it. Hopefully it's the former, and that you've actually come to have a sense of love and also recognition of the beauty of what this represents. This is the church coming together and agreeing on things. Now, you have been in the church for a while, I'm assuming. You know how hard that is. And so the fact that this exists is something of a miracle, and it is a beautiful resource, not only for our own worship and our life, but for the world. It reflects not only our common prayer and theology, but also the way in which Anglicanism has come to take root in this land and this area, which is a statement also in its own right to the wider communion and the wider church. So, have your views on this book changed? If I haven't swayed it just then, hopefully we've done so earlier on in the lecture, in the conversations and the lectures. So please pause the video, have a conversation with those around you, discuss whether it's changed at all, whether you think it's better or worse, whatever it might be, and then come back to us as we wrap up the lecture. Hope that was a profound conversation and that you had a group agreement that Deborah and I have done a great job of convincing you how wonderful the New Zealand Prayer Book is and how we can use it even better within our life and in our worship, but also within our own homes and our own communities, our own families. It is a wonderful resource to work through. On behalf of Deborah, who is at the moment standing behind the computer running all of the recording of this, and myself, I wish to thank you for joining us over these 5 lectures. It is really a joy to produce these and to teach them alongside Deborah, but I hope some of the joy of that teaching and expression also comes through in your receiving of it, not only gaining wisdom, but a sense of 2 priests whose life really does revolve somewhat around what we do with this book and how that has played a part in our ministry and our lives as well. Look forward to being in touch with you throughout the course of this course and also in the future as well. You may be watching this actually at a totally different date and you may have a question or two. Feel free to be in touch and we can answer anything about those ones as well. But as it is, at the moment we're recording in the lead up to Christmas in 2025. Who knows what year it might be. You may see, well, we changed the colours in the background so that you don't look too much like we're constantly in the same season. But regardless of what season you may be heading into, we hope that the resources of the prayer book as well as your church's life can bring life to the celebration that is before you, whether that be a saint's day or a feast day or simply a day where you're doing a daily Eucharist. May it be a blessing to you and you a blessing to the people that you love and serve. So go well, enjoy, and see you in the future for more teaching opportunities as well. See you.